October 20th, 2011. A man who had ruled Libya for 42 years found himself trapped in a drainage pipe beneath a desert highway. Hours earlier, he had been sleeping in a compound surrounded by loyal guards, still believing he could outlast his enemies. Now, covered in dust and blood, he pleaded with the fighters who dragged him from his hiding place. The cell phone cameras that captured his final moments would broadcast images that shocked the world and mark the end of one of the most bizarre dictatorships of the modern era. The coastal city where Gaddafi was born had been under siege for weeks. Buildings stood gutted by artillery fire. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. The National Transitional Council forces, backed by NATO airstrikes, had been steadily tightening their grip on the city, but pockets of resistance remained fierce. Gaddafi was hiding in District 2, a residential area that had become one of the last strongholds of his supporters. He had been moving between several buildings in the neighborhood, never staying in one place for too long. The compound where he spent the night of October 18th belonged to a family whose loyalty he trusted. It was a modest structure by the standards of the palaces he once inhabited, but it offered protection and allowed him to stay close to his remaining fighters. The previous months had been a nightmare of retreat and loss. The uprising that began in February had spread across Libya with stunning speed. City after city had fallen to rebel forces. His own security apparatus had crumbled. Officers he'd trusted for decades defected or simply disappeared. Family members had fled or been killed. The international community had turned against him completely. NATO warplanes controlled the skies, striking his forces whenever they concentrated. His grand visions of African unity and his role as a revolutionary icon had collapsed into desperate survival. But Gaddafi maintained his defiance even as his world shrank. He had been making audio recordings, broadcasting messages of resistance through sympathetic channels. He insisted that Libya's people still loved him, that the rebels were foreign agents and traitors, that he would rather die than leave Libya. Whether he truly believed this or was simply performing for posterity remained unclear, but he kept up the facade of confidence even as reality closed in around him. That morning, October 19th, his security team informed him that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The NTC forces were preparing for a major push. NATO reconnaissance aircraft had been flying more missions over District 2. The compound was no longer safe. They needed to move, and they needed to move soon. Gaddafi agreed to prepare for departure, but he seemed to lack the urgency the moment demanded. He had survived so many close calls over his long rule that perhaps he couldn't quite believe this time was different. The convoy that would attempt to break out of Sirte consisted of approximately 40 to 50 vehicles. The exact number varies depending on who tells the story, but it was substantial. A desperate gamble to move a large group in hopes that some vehicles would make it through. The convoy included pickup trucks with mounted weapons, SUVs carrying fighters and commanders, vehicles packed with ammunition and supplies, and the precious few luxury cars that carried Gaddafi himself and his closest associates. Mansour Dao, Gaddafi's security chief and one of his longest-serving loyalists, coordinated the evacuation. Dao had been with Gaddafi for decades, surviving purges and palace intrigues. His presence symbolized how far the inner circle had shrunk. So many others were dead, captured, or fled. Also in the convoy was Muammar Gaddafi, the dictator's son, who had served as Libya's national security advisor. Several other former government officials and military commanders who had nowhere else to go completed the group. The plan was to head south, away from the coast, toward the town of Jarif. From there, they hoped to regroup with other loyalist forces and continue resistance from the desert regions where government control had always been stronger. It was a thin hope, but it was all they had left. The alternative was to stay in Sirte and wait for the inevitable final assault. At least movement offered a chance, however slim. Around 8 a.m. on October 20th, the convoy prepared to depart. Gaddafi wore simple military-style clothing, far removed from the elaborate uniforms and robes he'd favored during his years of power. He carried a golden pistol, a weapon that seemed almost absurdly out of place given the circumstances, but that represented his self-image as a revolutionary leader. The vehicles loaded up with armed men, ammunition, food, water, and whatever valuables and documents people thought worth saving. The convoy left the compound in District 2 around 8:30 a.m., moving in a long column through the devastated streets of Sirte. The drivers tried to maintain spacing between vehicles to reduce the target they presented while staying close enough to provide mutual support if attacked. The route they chose headed west initially before turning south, trying to avoid the main concentrations of NTC forces. For the first stretch of the journey, things proceeded better than expected. The convoy moved through areas where fighting had destroyed so much that no one controlled anything anymore. Rubble-filled streets slowed their progress but also provided cover. They passed burned-out buildings, abandoned checkpoints, and the wreckage of previous battles. The residents who remained in these areas, mostly elderly people or families with nowhere to go, watched the convoy pass without interfering. The vehicles eventually reached Highway 1, the main coastal road. This was the most dangerous part of the plan. The highway offered speed and a direct route south, but it also meant exposure. The convoy would be visible from the air and vulnerable to any NTC forces in the area. But the alternative of trying to navigate through destroyed neighborhoods and debris-choked streets would take too long. Speed was now essential. The convoy turned onto the highway and accelerated. The vehicles spread out slightly, trying to look less like a military column and more like civilian traffic, though the weapons mounted on many of the trucks made this fiction unconvincing. For several kilometers, the journey continued without incident. Perhaps they would make it. Perhaps NATO wasn't watching this particular stretch of road this particular morning. Perhaps luck would finally favor them after months of disasters. But NATO was watching. A French reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy around 8 a.m., though the exact timing in which NATO member first identified the vehicles remains disputed in various accounts. The aircraft followed the convoy, relaying coordinates and information to command centers. The decision was made to engage. NATO had been supporting the rebel forces throughout the conflict with airstrikes on Gaddafi's military assets. A convoy of this size, clearly military in nature and moving in loyalist-controlled areas, was a legitimate target under the mission parameters. American Predator drones armed with Hellfire missiles moved into position first. French fighter jets armed with precision weapons were also scrambled. The convoy was approximately 4 kilometers west of Sirte when the attack began. The first missile struck a vehicle near the front of the convoy around 8:30 a.m. The explosion was devastating, flipping the vehicle and scattering debris across the highway. The convoy immediately fell into chaos. Drivers accelerated, swerved, or stopped depending on their training and instincts. Some vehicles tried to continue forward. Others attempted U-turns to head back to Sirte. A few drivers simply abandoned their vehicles and ran. The second missile hit moments after the first, striking another vehicle. Then, another explosion, and another. The drones and aircraft made multiple passes, firing at the concentrated targets on the highway. The convoy broke apart completely under the assault. Vehicles scattered in all directions. Some drivers headed off the road into the desert scrubland beside the highway, hoping to find cover. Others sought shelter in the drainage ditches that ran parallel to the road. Several vehicles were completely destroyed, their occupants killed instantly. The ammunition loaded in some trucks detonated when hit, creating secondary explosions that added to the carnage. Gaddafi's vehicle, a Toyota Land Cruiser, was hit but not destroyed. The driver managed to get the damaged vehicle off the highway. According to survivors, Gaddafi was stunned by the blast but not seriously injured at this point. The vehicle stopped in a wadi, a dried riverbed, about 200 meters from the highway. Other survivors from the convoy gathered around, seeking cover in the depression. They were trapped between the ongoing airstrikes and NTC forces that would inevitably be attracted by the explosions and smoke. The airstrikes continued for roughly an hour, though to those sheltering in the wadi, it must have felt like an eternity. NATO aircraft circled overhead, occasionally firing at vehicles attempting to flee or at groups of armed men spotted in the open. The sound was constant, the roar of jet engines, the whistle of missiles, the explosions, the secondary detonations of ammunition cooking off and burning vehicles. Approximately 50 to 75 people from the convoy had survived the initial strikes and made it to the wadi and the surrounding area. They included Muammar Gaddafi, Mansour Dao, several bodyguards, military commanders, and ordinary fighters who had been loyal to the regime. Some were injured from the explosions or from vehicle crashes as they tried to escape the highway. They had weapons but no heavy equipment, no way to fight aircraft, and no realistic path to escape. Gaddafi and his inner circle held a quick conference. The situation was desperate but not yet hopeless. If they could stay hidden until nightfall, they might be able to move under cover of darkness. NTC forces would come searching, but the survivors were armed and could potentially fight their way through a light enemy presence. The key was staying concealed and avoiding capture until they had a better opportunity. The group split up to reduce the chances of everyone being captured or killed together. Some men stayed in the wadi. Others moved to abandoned buildings nearby. A small group, including Gaddafi, made their way to a large drainage pipe that ran under the highway. The pipe was about 1.5 meters in diameter, large enough for a person to enter but confining and dark. It offered protection from airstrikes and would be difficult to spot from a distance. Gaddafi crawled into the pipe with several bodyguards. The golden pistol he carried was an awkward burden in the cramped space. They moved into the pipe far enough to be out of sight from either end, then settled in to wait. The sound of airstrikes continued outside, though they were now targeting other survivors or vehicles farther away. The immediate danger seemed to have passed, replaced by the excruciating tension of waiting and not knowing what would happen next. Meanwhile, NTC forces in Sirte had heard the explosions and seen the smoke rising from the highway. They knew immediately that something significant had happened. Units that had been preparing for another day of house-to-house fighting in the city redirected toward the highway. Radio chatter spread the word. A large convoy had been hit. Survivors were scattered around the area. This might be something important. The rebel fighters who responded came from various groups. The National Transitional Council forces were never a unified army, but rather a coalition of militias, local fighters, defected military units, and volunteers who had taken up arms. The units that reached the highway that morning included fighters from Sirte, a city that had endured a brutal siege by Gaddafi's forces earlier in the conflict. These men had particular reason to hate the regime and sought revenge for friends and family members killed in that fighting. The NTC fighters spread out, searching the area systematically. They found dead bodies near destroyed vehicles on the highway. They discovered small groups of survivors in the wadi and in buildings, engaging in brief firefights. Some loyalists surrendered immediately. Others fought until they were killed, or their ammunition ran out. The searching continued for hours as the rebels worked through the area, checking every potential hiding place. Around 12:30 p.m., approximately 4 hours after the airstrikes began, a group of NTC fighters from Sirte approached the drainage pipe where Gaddafi was hiding. Different accounts exist of exactly how they discovered him. Some claim they were systematically checking every possible hiding spot. Others suggest that wounded loyalists captured earlier had revealed, under pressure, where Gaddafi had gone. Another version holds that the fighters saw fresh tracks leading to the pipe or noticed disturbed dust around the entrance. Whatever led them there, the fighters approached the pipe cautiously. They could see it was large enough to hide people, but entering it would be dangerous if armed men waited inside. They called out, ordering anyone inside to come out. No response came initially. They fired warning shots into the pipe. Still nothing. One fighter took a grenade and rolled it into the pipe, the explosion echoing through the confined space. After the grenade detonated, voices called out from inside the pipe. People were in there and they were willing to come out. The fighters maintained their positions, weapons ready, as figures began emerging from the pipe. They were covered in dust, some bleeding from wounds. The fighters ordered them to keep their hands visible, to move slowly, searching each person as they came out for weapons. Then Muammar Gaddafi emerged from the pipe. His distinctive features were recognizable despite the dust and blood. His hair, dyed black for decades, was disheveled. His face showed cuts and bruises. His clothing was torn and filthy. He no longer resembled the carefully groomed leader who had appeared in countless photographs and videos over 42 years of rule. He looked like an old man who had been through something terrible. The fighters recognized him immediately. The reaction was electric. Some shouted his name, others cursed him. Cell phones came out instantly, with multiple fighters beginning to record video. Gaddafi was pulled roughly from the pipe. Hands grabbed him. Weapons pointed at him from every direction. He seemed dazed, possibly injured from the grenade blast, certainly in shock at his situation. The video captured on those cell phones shows confused, chaotic moments. Dozens of fighters crowded around, everyone wanting to see the captured dictator. Gaddafi appears to say something, asking what he had done to deserve this treatment, seeming not to comprehend that his decades of rule had created precisely these circumstances. The fighters were not gentle. He was pushed, pulled, hit. Some fighters wanted to take him prisoner properly. Others wanted immediate retribution. Mansour Dao and Muammar Gaddafi were also pulled from the pipe or from nearby hiding spots around this same time. The group of prisoners was moved away from the pipe, half carried, half dragged by the excited fighters. More NTC units arrived, drawn by the radio reports that Gaddafi had been captured. The area became crowded with armed men, vehicles, and growing chaos as everyone wanted to witness this historic moment. What happened in the next 30 to 60 minutes remains the subject of intense dispute, investigation, and controversy. Multiple videos exist, filmed on cell phones by various fighters present. Human rights organizations later analyzed this footage, trying to establish a timeline and understand exactly what occurred. Official investigations were conducted. Witness testimonies were collected, though many witnesses gave conflicting accounts. The truth lies somewhere in the confusion of those chaotic moments, and some aspects will never be fully known. The videos show Gaddafi being placed on the hood of a pickup truck at some point, surrounded by fighters. He appears injured and disoriented. Blood is visible on his face and clothing. Whether these injuries came from the grenade in the pipe, the rough handling by the captors, or deliberate violence remains unclear from the footage alone. Fighters crowd around, some filming, some simply watching, others shouting. The decision of what to do with the captured dictator should have been straightforward. Take him into custody, transport him to a secure location, hold him for trial. The National Transitional Council had publicly committed to respecting human rights and following proper legal procedures. But on that roadside, with dozens of armed fighters from units that had lost friends and family to Gaddafi's forces, with emotions running high and no clear command structure, the situation was volatile. At some point, the decision was made, or perhaps simply happened, without any formal decision to move the prisoners. They were put into vehicles to be transported. The convoy of vehicles containing Gaddafi, his son Muammar, Mansour Dao, and their captors began moving. The destination was supposed to be Misrata, where NTC leadership could take custody of the prisoners. But the journey would not be completed. Gunfire erupted. The circumstances remain disputed. Some accounts claim crossfire from remaining loyalists. Others suggest it was fighters executing prisoners. The vehicles stopped or crashed. More chaos ensued. When it was over, Muammar Gaddafi was dead, killed by gunshot wounds. His son Muammar was also dead or died shortly after from his wounds. Mansour Dao survived and was taken into custody. The exact moment of Gaddafi's death was not clearly captured on video, though footage from before and after exists. The official account from the NTC claimed he died in crossfire during an ongoing battle. An autopsy later performed at the insistence of international observers concluded that Gaddafi died from a gunshot wound to the head, fired at close range. The trajectory and nature of the wound were inconsistent with combat crossfire and suggested execution, though the official findings remained ambiguous on this point. The body of Muammar Gaddafi, along with his son Mutamim's body, was transported to Misrata. Rather than being treated with the dignity typically afforded to the deceased, even deceased enemies, the bodies were displayed publicly. They were placed in a commercial freezer at a shopping center in Misrata, where crowds lined up to view them. For several days, people filed through to see for themselves that the dictator was really dead. The public display disturbed many international observers. The UN, human rights organizations, and various governments expressed concern. The Geneva Conventions and basic principles of human dignity argue against such treatment of the dead. But for many Libyans, particularly those in Misrata, who had suffered so much under Gaddafi's forces, the display served a purpose. It provided proof. It offered closure. It allowed people to see with their own eyes that the man who had dominated their lives for over 4 decades was gone. The National Transitional Council leadership faced awkward questions. They had promised to capture Gaddafi and put him on trial. They had committed to respecting international law and human rights. Instead, he had been killed in circumstances that strongly suggested execution rather than combat death. The official story of Crossfire satisfied few serious observers, but the chaos of the situation and the number of different fighters present made assigning specific responsibility nearly impossible. Libya's interim Prime Minister Mahmoud Jibril announced Gaddafi's death at a press conference, declaring that the dictator had been killed in crossfire between NTC fighters and loyalists. He acknowledged that the circumstances were still being investigated, but emphasized that Libya was now free from dictatorship. The announcement was met with celebrations across Libya and in many other parts of the world. People took to the streets, firing weapons in the air, honking horns, waving flags, celebrating the end of an era. The international reaction was more measured. President Barack Obama acknowledged Gaddafi's death and spoke of a new chapter for Libya. European leaders made similar statements, but alongside the official responses came questions about the manner of death and concerns about Libya's future stability. Killing Gaddafi rather than capturing him alive eliminated the possibility of a trial that might have provided truth and accountability, that might have allowed victims to confront their oppressor, that might have established a stronger foundation for justice in the new Libya. The investigation into Gaddafi's death produced several reports, but no criminal charges. The circumstances were too confused, too many people were involved, and the political will to prosecute NTC fighters for killing Gaddafi simply didn't exist. Human Rights Watch and other organizations documented evidence suggesting war crimes in the final moments. But Libya's new government had more pressing priorities than investigating how the old dictator died. Gaddafi was eventually buried in an unmarked grave in the desert, the location kept secret to prevent the site from becoming a shrine for any remaining supporters or a target for desecration by his enemies. His bizarre 42-year rule was over. The Libya he had shaped through force, oil wealth, and erratic vision now faced the challenge of building something new from the ruins. Understanding Gaddafi's final 24 hours requires understanding how he reached that drainage pipe. The leader who once commanded significant military forces, who built an elaborate security state, who cultivated a carefully crafted international image as a revolutionary and visionary, had seen it all disintegrate in 8 months. The uprising that began in February 2011 started in Benghazi, Libya's second-largest city. Inspired by the Arab Spring movements that had toppled leaders in Tunisia and Egypt, Libyan protesters took to the streets demanding reforms, then demanding Gaddafi's departure. The regime's response was brutal. Security forces fired on protesters. The military received orders to crush the demonstrations. Gaddafi himself gave a televised speech in which he described protesters as foreign agents and traitors, warning he would hunt them down and cleanse Libya. But unlike in Tunisia and Egypt, where militaries ultimately refused to keep firing on protesters, segments of the Libyan military defected to the opposition. The protests transformed into armed rebellion. City after city fell to rebel control. The eastern half of the country broke away almost completely. Gaddafi held the west and the capital, Tripoli, but his grip was slipping. The international community intervened in March 2011. The UN Security Council authorized a no-fly zone and protection of civilians. NATO took charge of the mission, which quickly evolved beyond its original mandate into active support for the rebels. NATO aircraft struck Gaddafi's military forces, command centers, and communications infrastructure. The regime's ability to coordinate and conduct operations was systematically degraded. Through spring and summer 2011, the situation deteriorated for Gaddafi. His forces suffered defeat after defeat. Key cities fell. Officers defected or were killed. International sanctions froze his assets and isolated his government. His family began to fracture. Some members fled to neighboring countries. Others died in NATO strikes or rebel attacks. By August, the rebels were ready to assault Tripoli. The battle for the capital was intense, but relatively brief. The regime's forces, worn down by months of fighting and NATO strikes, couldn't hold. Tripoli fell, and Gaddafi disappeared. For weeks, his whereabouts remained unknown. He released audio messages claiming he was still in Libya, still fighting, that he would die rather than surrender. Intelligence agencies and rebel forces searched intensively, but couldn't locate him. He had fled to Sirte, his birthplace, and a city where he still commanded loyalty. Sirte became the last major stronghold. The NTC forces surrounded the city and began a siege that lasted weeks. The fighting was brutal, grinding down the defenders through constant pressure and NATO support. The civilians trapped in Sirte suffered terribly, caught between the fighting forces with limited access to food, water, or medical care. By mid-October, Sirte was almost completely in NTC hands. Only a few districts remained contested. Gaddafi was trapped there with a shrinking circle of loyalists. He could have tried to flee earlier, perhaps to a neighboring country that might have offered exile. He had opportunities to negotiate a surrender that might have included guarantees of safety. But he chose to stay, either from genuine belief in his cause, from stubborn pride, or from inability to accept that his era was finished. Gaddafi's death came during a period of tremendous upheaval across the Middle East and North Africa. The Arab Spring had begun in Tunisia in December 2010, when a street vendor set himself on fire after harassment by authorities. That act of desperation sparked protests that quickly spread across the region. Tunisia's president fled. Egypt's president fell after massive demonstrations. Syria descended into civil war. Yemen, Bahrain, and other countries experienced significant unrest. Libya's trajectory was unique in several ways. The uprising transformed into full civil war more quickly than in other countries. The international intervention was more direct and sustained than elsewhere. The ultimate toppling of the regime was more violent and complete. Gaddafi's death, captured on cell phone video and broadcast globally, became one of the defining images of the Arab Spring era, a stark symbol of how far dictators could fall. But Libya's transition after Gaddafi proved extremely difficult. The country descended into chaos, with competing militias, regional divisions, and eventually a renewed civil war. The hope that NATO intervention and Gaddafi's removal would lead to democracy and stability was not realized. Instead, Libya became a failed state, with rival governments, continued fighting, humanitarian crises, and a base for terrorist groups and human trafficking networks. The legacy of Gaddafi's bizarre 42-year rule weighed heavily on the country. He had deliberately weakened institutions that might challenge his power, leaving Libya without strong civilian governance structures. He had played tribes and regions against each other to maintain control, creating divisions that would explode after his fall. The oil wealth that might have built a prosperous nation had instead funded his megalomania and security apparatus. The cult of personality he built around himself left no space for alternative leadership to develop. His foreign policy had been equally erratic. He supported terrorist groups in the 1980s, leading to international isolation. He pursued weapons of mass destruction programs until giving them up in 2003, in exchange for normalized relations with the West. He styled himself as a pan-African leader, proposing a United States of Africa with himself as its leader. He wrote his Green Book, a rambling political manifesto that supposedly offered a third way between capitalism and communism, but mostly reflected his personal idiosyncrasies. The treatment of his own people ranged from paternalistic to brutal. Oil revenues funded subsidies that provided relatively high living standards compared to other African nations, but political freedom was non-existent. The security services, including the notorious revolutionary committees, monitored everyone. Dissent was crushed. Public executions were broadcast to intimidate potential opposition. Thousands of political prisoners filled jails. Entire populations were displaced or persecuted if they fell out of favor. The images of Gaddafi being pulled from that drainage pipe, bloodied and disoriented, captured by dozens of cell phone cameras, represent a stark lesson about the nature of power and its limits. For 42 years, he had seemed untouchable. He survived multiple coup attempts and assassination plots. He outlasted numerous other African dictators. He adapted his image and policies when necessary to survive. Yet, in the end, his power evaporated in months, and he died on a roadside, killed by his own people. The speed of his collapse was remarkable. In February 2011, he still controlled Libya completely. By October, he was dead. The mechanisms of control he'd built so carefully over decades proved fragile when truly tested. The military units he'd cultivated couldn't or wouldn't save him. The security services that had kept the population afraid either defected or became ineffective once people stopped being afraid. The cult of personality he'd nurtured for so long dissolved when it became clear he was vulnerable. The role of social media and cell phone cameras in his downfall and death cannot be overstated. Unlike dictators who fell in previous eras, Gaddafi's final moments were documented extensively by ordinary people with smartphones. The videos spread globally within hours. They showed him as he truly was at the end, an old man, frightened and defeated, no longer the larger-than-life figure from the propaganda. This transparency, this inability to control the narrative even at the moment of death, marked a new era in how regime changes unfold. The questions raised by his execution rather than capture continue to resonate. Would a trial have been better for Libya? What might he have revealed about those who supported him, both domestically and internationally? Would facing his accusers in court have provided more justice than his death on that roadside? The loss of that opportunity to establish legal accountability and historical record was significant, though understandable given the circumstances. The international community's role in his downfall also warrants examination. NATO's intervention prevented Gaddafi from crushing the rebellion in its early stages, likely saving thousands of lives. But the intervention also escalated the conflict, contributed to Libya's post-war instability, and ended with Gaddafi's death under circumstances that violated the principles the intervention supposedly upheld. The mission to protect civilians evolved into regime change, a shift that had long-term consequences. Returning to those final 24 hours, from the morning of October 19th to midday October 20th, 2011, the trajectory seems almost inevitable in hindsight. A trapped dictator attempting a desperate breakout, his convoy destroyed by airstrikes, his capture by rebel forces, his death amid the chaos. Yet for Gaddafi himself, each moment must have carried uncertainty about what would happen next. When he woke up on October 19th in that compound in Sirte, did he believe he might still escape? Did he think about trying to negotiate surrender? Did he accept that death was likely? Or did he cling to hope until the very end? The recordings he made during his final months suggest he remained defiant, but words recorded for propaganda purposes don't reveal internal thoughts. The decision to attempt the convoy breakout rather than stay in Sirte was a calculated gamble that failed catastrophically. Had they attempted the move at night rather than in daylight, the outcome might have been different. Had NATO aircraft been engaged elsewhere that morning, they might have made it through. But these what-ifs don't change what actually happened. The hours hiding in that drainage pipe must have been excruciating. Cramped, uncomfortable, unable to see what was happening outside, hearing the sounds of fighting and searching, knowing that discovery meant either capture or death. For a man who had lived in palaces, who had commanded armies, who had met with world leaders as an equal, the degradation of hiding in a concrete pipe represented a complete reversal of fortune. His death, when it came, was brutal and undignified. Whatever crimes he committed during his rule, whatever suffering he caused, he was still a human being, and the manner of his killing was troubling from a humanitarian and legal perspective. The fact that it was filmed and broadcast made it more disturbing, turning his death into spectacle rather than justice. The final 24 hours of Muammar Gaddafi were the culmination of choices made over decades. His repressive rule, his failure to build legitimate institutions, his cultivation of personal loyalty over professional military structures, his bizarre foreign policy adventures, his growing detachment from reality, all contributed to his ultimate fate. When the moment came that the population rose against him, he lacked the tools to survive. Force and fear had kept him in power, and when those failed, nothing remained. Libya continues to struggle with Gaddafi's legacy. The country remains divided, unstable, and suffering. The promise of the 2011 revolution has not been fulfilled. Whether the manner of Gaddafi's death contributed to this ongoing instability is debatable. But the loss of accountability that a trial might have provided certainly didn't help Libya build a foundation for justice and reconciliation. The images from October 20th, 2011 remain powerful and disturbing. They show the end of a dictatorship, the death of a dictator, and the chaos that comes when order collapses without something stable ready to replace it. They show the best and worst of human nature, the desire for freedom that drove the uprising, and the violence and disorder that characterized its conclusion. Muammar Gaddafi's final 24 hours were a tragedy, both for him personally and for Libya as a nation. Not a tragedy in the sense that he was an innocent victim. He was not, but in the sense of wasted potential and opportunities lost. Libya could have transitioned peacefully from his rule. He could have stepped down with dignity. Justice could have been served through proper legal channels. Instead, the country got chaos, and he got a drainage pipe and a roadside death captured on cell phone cameras. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.